Oh, that's still there. Good. Death range. Okay. Okay. Just a few minutes. Starting. Okay, guys, we're going to start in just a few more minutes. Right now, we only have 3 people viewing. I'd like to have a little bit more than that, so we'll give late responders just a little bit more time. So let me put down a timestamp so everyone can know. Start in, let's do 4 minutes. This was posted at 10:30. Basically, people are just a little bit slow showing up, which is just fine, but you know, minor annoyance. I like to see more viewers. All right, we're gonna need a spreadsheet today. There it is. And that is one of my kids running down the hall. How are your courses going? Anybody having some issues? You do you prefer the online sessions, or do you like the in class lectures a little bit more? I gotta be honest, I like the in class lectures a bit more. The back and forth is a little bit more fun, I think. That's actually kind of funny. I wouldn't expect that. Yeah. I hear that. It's engaging in both for both you and us. Plus, there's just so many distractions at home that I don't know, that cause you to lose focus. There was a funny story about a professor using Zoom, and what happened was one of his students was cleaning a turkey while listening to the lecture. So it was just kind of like one of these funny things that you know show that people aren't focused on the task at hand. I mean, I think it'd be really difficult to pay attention to a lecture while cleaning a turkey. All right, just about ready to start. Okay, let's start. All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to pick up where we left off, and we're first going to talk about how banks actually create money. Then after that, we're going to introduce monetary policy, which is, it's another tool that the government can use to try to steer us out of recessions. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with how banks create money. Banks create money using something called the fractional reserve system. And what that entails is that when you deposit some money in the bank doesn't actually have to keep all of it on hand. They can just keep a portion of it on hand for day-to-day operations and, to satisfy individual demand for money. Like, say someone wants to have some cash, that means they can just go to the bank and draw it out. So banks don't need to have all the money that their depositors actually have on them at the time. What they can do is they can make loans out on that. And when they do that, that becomes money that is spent by somebody else, and that creates income for another person. And so this creates like a snowballing effect where you end up having just a small deposit in the bank making quite a bit of new money. All right, so this is actually also why bank runs are so dangerous, because if everybody demands their cash, wants to withdraw everything at once, well, the bank's not going to be able to satisfy that because a lot of their deposits are actually going to be lent out to other people. So if people try to all get their money in mass, well, then the whole system collapses and the bank goes under. There are a number of sad cases where this happened. People's savings were destroyed. Interestingly enough, this also almost happened during the '08 recession, during the financial crisis, and the government had to come in and basically shut down a number of banks that, didn't have, that just weren't up to snuff, right? They made out bad loans, and, they just weren't healthy enough to run in the long run. And so those banks were closed down. In terms of how we prevent bank runs today, if you are a typical Joe Blow, your deposits are generally insured by something called the FDIC, and it's just depositors insurance. And what that means is that if the bank closes down and you have less than, I think, $200,000 in the bank, basically you get that money back. So for the typical American, that's a bank. Your money in a bank is pretty safe, even in the event of a bank run. Now, people who are extraordinarily wealthy, well, they probably shouldn't have all that cash just sitting around, because that money could be out there making them money through investments. But if they are in that class, well, then they probably won't get all of their money back. All right, so basically, to review how banks create money. Federal Reserve will end up creating $100 bills, or someone's going to end up depositing $100 bills in a bank. That money's just sitting there at the bank, so the bank loans out a portion of it, and that portion gets spent and becomes income for someone else and redeposited into the bank, and the bank loans a portion of that out, and that creates money. Now, what's interesting is that the amount of money that's created through this process isn't infinite, and it depends on something called the reserve requirement. Now, we're going to go into what the reserve requirement is in detail later on, but let's just write this term down. The reserve requirement. And the reserve requirement is basically the amount of funds a bank is required to keep on hand. So they can't make loans out on this. So let's go put that in parentheses. Can't loan out this portion of a deposit. You follow that? I think you should. It's not too terrible. So let's imagine a scenario where the reserve requirement is 10%. And you go in and you deposit $100. Well, if the reserve requirement is 10%, well, that means the bank can make loans out on 90% of that $100. Got the multiplication sign in the wrong place. And then this becomes, so this is person number 1, this is person number 2. And so the third person, this $90 becomes income for someone else. And then it's redeposited in the bank. And so this process gets repeated over and over again. And so new deposits are created. Now what you're going to see is that, you know, the amount of money that's created after that initial deposit gets smaller and smaller because it's just 90% of it, because the bank has to keep 10% of that on hand. All right, so we'll just keep rolling all the way down to get an idea. And eventually we're getting into very small numbers, right? So what we can do is we can take the sum of this to find out how much money is actually created with a $100 deposit. And so in this case, you deposit an initial $100 deposit and a reserve requirement of 10% is going to create $1,000. And I know you see this 0.9, this $999, 0.9971, but if we keep going this into infinite, and keep going smaller and smaller and smaller, what you're going to end up seeing is that this number is going to gradually approach 1,000. So just to show that, let's do F200, and see now we're at 1,000. So just this small amount of money deposited ends up creating 10 times that amount. And this gives us the formula for the money multiplier. It's equal to, the simple money multiplier is just going to be equal to 1 over the reserve requirement. And so this right here is the money multiplier. R is equal to reserve requirement. All right, so this is a simple money multiplier. There are more complicated ones, and they are going to reduce the amount of, and they will all result in a smaller percent, or not smaller, a smaller amount of money created. So right now, this model is assuming that banks don't hold any excess reserves, and people also don't hold any excess cash, because what that means is that new deposits are missing some amount. That this instead of depositing the full $90 back in the bank, Joe Blow decides that he's going to keep a little bit of cash on hand. Alternatively, the bank could decide, all right, the government's only making us keep 10% of deposited funds on hand. Well, maybe we want to keep 11%. So let's see what happens if we complicate this a little bit more, have a more realistic money multiplier. So let's imagine that the bank wants to keep some excess reserves. And they want to keep an additional, I don't know, an additional 10%. So that means their actual, the actual cash on hand, instead of being just 0.1, it's going to be 0.1 plus the excess reserves. Now, what I'd like you to do is try to figure out how much cash would be created from a $100 deposit if banks are required to keep 10% reserves, and the bank also chooses to keep 10% in excess reserves. So I'm going to write this question down for you. See if you can figure out how if the reserve requirement is 10% and banks hold an extra 10% in I'll give you a few moments to try to figure that out. We got one answer. Does anybody else disagree with that? Well, let's test this out. I'm just going to press enter right here, and we'll see what happens. Equals that times 0.8. Scroll it all the way down. And there we go. The correct answer is 500. And so there's two ways we can find this. First of all, we could have just gone the long way and said that, all right, so banks are only loaning out 80% of each deposit. Or we could have taken the amount of the initial deposit, which is 100, and multiplied it by the money multiplier, which in this case would be 1 divided by the reserve requirement plus the excess reserves. In this case, forgot to have an even parentheses, that would drive me bonkers. In this case, we would just do 100 times 1 divided by 0.2. And then we get 500 there too. So yeah, the correct answer there is 500. So there are even more complicated money multipliers. I'm not going to go into too much detail about them because basically they get into the same idea. If you have leakages from the system, people hold on to extra money, well then the money multiplier is going to be quite a bit smaller. So, let's just imagine that people, instead of depositing the full amount back in the bank, they hold a little bit of cash. Well, that means there's less money for the bank to make loans out on. So the money multiplier is going to fall. All right. So let's think about some reasons why people want to hold on to money. Well, banks might want to hold on to extra money because they may foresee there might be a run, or they want to have a little extra cash on hand for like some sort of sporting event or something like that. Those are some boring reasons. The more reasonable ones that you're going to have day-to-day experience with are the reasons why you would actually want to hold on to a little bit of cash. And there's 3 primary reasons. The first one is the transactions motive. The transactions motives is, you just need to hold on to some cash for spending. Some places, the nice thing about money is that it is a liquid asset that can be relatively quickly converted to something that you need. You can't do this with other types of assets. So having a little bit of cash on hand is a good thing, so you can have transactions. The second one is the precautionary motive. And this idea is that you want to hold on to a little extra cash just in case, you have some emergency come up and you need to spend money to satisfy some need. This is a little bit disturbing when you think about it, but there was a recent Pew survey that came out and said that roughly, I think, 40 to 50% of Americans didn't have enough cash on hand to take care of a $1,000 emergency. I mean, that's a little bit depressing. There was another interesting story that came out of COVID-19. I think it was roughly a third of renters were unable to pay their rent for a month. I mean, that's another scary thing that's happened. And then the final reason why people might want to hold money is something called the speculative motive. And this is the idea that you kind of want to hold on to cash to avoid holding on to financial assets that are falling in value. And so this is one of those reasons why people started pulling out of the stock market amidst the COVID-19 crisis. So you had assets, stocks, bonds, they're falling in value. And once that begins to happen, well, that means people are losing wealth. And so people, they don't like losing wealth. Losing wealth is a bad thing. So they start selling those assets, converting them into cash. And that cash is going to be relatively safe compared to the assets that are losing value and losing value relatively quickly. So those are the 3 primary motives. Let's see if we have them on the slide so that you can review them at your leisure. All right, so we've gone over the money multiplier, and this is the simple money multiplier. assumes that people do not hold cash, assumes banks have no excess reserves, and in other words, there are no other leakages. I think we went over that one. All right, we went over this one. These are more realistic money multipliers. This one right here is a money multiplier that assumes that some excess reserves are being held by banks. And this one, when we add these two together, we can get a money multiplier that is a lot more realistic. We're not going to get into those details. All right, so why do we hold money? Transactions motives, we hit that. Needed money for spending. We hit the precautionary motive. Needed for unanticipated or unexpected expenses, things like emergencies or impulse buys. And then we have the speculative motive, and that's holding to avoid holding a financial asset during a financial crisis. Hold a little bit of cash on hand so that you don't have this, so you're not holding a financial asset that's losing value. Interestingly enough, the speculative motive works in two ways as well. So you might want to hold on to some cash if you think that financial assets, they're going to fall in the near future. And the reason is because if the financial asset falls in price and it's just a temporary fall in price, well, then it might make sense to convert some of that cash into the financial asset because you expect it to rise in the near future. We can actually somewhat see this if we went to Yahoo Finance. I don't know if this is going to work, but let's find out. Or we can look at the Dow. Ugh, come on. Here we go. So let's just look at the last 6 months. And there we go. Now this is pretty interesting. It's basically the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It's just the something that's trended, that's correlated with GDP. It's if this falls quite a bit, it signals that we're in a recession. We certainly are in a recession right now, but it looks like the recovery will be pretty quick as long as the restrictions on businesses start relaxing, which I think they probably will within the next month. Kansas and Missouri, they're probably going to open up, have a soft opening a little bit sooner than the rest of the country, which means people are going to be back to work here a little bit faster than other places such as New York. But anyway, let's take a look and see what happened. Well, COVID-19 concerns start to rise. Well, people want to start getting rid of their cash or getting rid of their financial assets because they don't want to lose a lot of wealth during COVID-19, and so then because of COVID-19, and so then we see asset prices fall and fall and fall. Well, then we get to this interesting kind of inflection point, which is partly due to the stimulus bill, but I also think that the market is starting to realize that COVID-19 is not going to be here forever. And because of that, that means a lot of these assets that plummeted in value, they're kind of undervalued. So all these people have excess cash on hand, and then they start using that cash to purchase financial assets that are perceived to be undervalued, and then they're going to start purchasing more of it. So, I think things are gradually looking better every day. All right, so let's return now to the slides. All right, so are there any questions on the financial sector? I'm going to type this out. I'll give you a few more moments to ask questions while I sip on my Diet Mountain Dew. Nope. All right. Well, let's move on now to monetary policy. All right, so monetary policy is policy that's enacted by a country's central bank, which is designed to influence the value of the dollar and therefore, or the money's supply, through changes in the value of the U.S. dollar or the currency in question. Now, there are two types of monetary policy. There is expansionary and contractionary monetary policy, and each of these policies are, they're controlled by three primary tools. We're going to get into these tools in detail later on, but just so you're aware of the names to start. The first one is the reserve requirement. The second one is the discount rate. And the third one is something called open market operations. And open market operations is it is the most common tool used by central banks to influence the value of the currency in question. All right, so before we go into detail about expansionary and contractionary monetary policy, I think it's a good idea to first have an idea of how a country's central bank, unlike your local banks that you go to, how a country's central bank ends up creating money. Now, it used to be that the country's the currency was backed by some amount of gold, and that's not the case any day. I mean, gold's useful, so there's no reason to really hoard it. I mean, you just end up distorting the value of it. I mean, gold's used in high-end electronics, and it also looks pretty. So why hoard a bunch of it when it can serve a useful role in society? So instead, we switch to something called fiat money, and fiat money is just money that has value because we all agreed that it had value. Now, our money that we use is they're dollar bills, but they're also called Federal Reserve notes, and these Federal Reserve notes are essentially IOUs, so like receipts of debt that the Federal Reserve owns the Treasury. So the way this works is that the Federal Reserve buys a Treasury bill from the U.S. Treasury and pays for this Treasury with an IOU, or a Federal Reserve note. Now, it takes this Federal Reserve this Federal Reserve note to the financial market and uses this to buy assets. And if it starts buying assets, typically Treasury bills and other types of financial assets, well, then it's injecting cash into the system because it's taking out a financial instrument, typically a T-bill, and it's giving back these Federal Reserve notes. So now there's more of these IOUs in the system. And so that's how the cash is created. So once banks have this cash, well, then they can go and make loans out of it, and then you end up having the fractional reserve banking system taking hold from there. All right. So why does money have value? And why did we just suddenly agree to it? Well, it just made sense. Probably people didn't think about the gold too much at the time. The other reason is that these Federal Reserve notes can be used to pay your taxes. And since everybody pays taxes, well, then these Federal Reserve notes actually have a tangible value to them. These IOUs have value. You can use them to pay your taxes. So, that's it's one of the reasons why they actually have value to them, in addition to them being fiat money. Right. So let's actually get to monetary policy. All right, monetary policy. It works through influence on credit conditions and the interest rates, which influence the value of the dollar. And this is going to have a direct effect on price levels, and because it's going to affect price levels, this is going to lead to changes in aggregate demand depending on the type of monetary policy that's being used. So we have this very indirect way of influencing GDP through changing the price level by engaging in different types of monetary policy. All right, so there's two types of monetary policy. There is expansionary monetary policy, and that is the policy that is aimed at stimulating aggregate demand. Contractionary monetary policy does the opposite. It destimulates aggregate demand, lowers the price level, and reduces production. So knowing this, what do you expect to happen to unemployment if the government engages in contractionary monetary policy? So let's go ahead and just write this question out, and I'll give you a few moments to answer it. Let me find my mouse cursor. Yep. Contractionary, sorry. So can somebody answer this question? What do we expect to happen to unemployment if the government engages in contractionary monetary policy? No guesses? All right. Well, let's give it away. If the government does engage in contractionary monetary policy, well, then what it's trying to do is destimulate aggregate demand, and by destimulating aggregate demand, it's reducing that C plus I plus G. It's trying to slow down production. And if that happens, well, that means the unemployment is going to increase. The opposite is the case with expansionary monetary policy. Hey, great, Dawson. All right. So let's move on. Find my mouse. So this is how expansionary contractionary monetary policy works. All right. So expansionary monetary policy is going to increase the money supply. By doing that, you end up decreasing the interest rate. Hey, great job, Cedric, too. By increasing the money supply, you decrease the interest rate. that increases investment, and because investment is going up, well, that means GDP is going to end up going up, at least temporarily. The second, the second way, the second type of policy, contractionary monetary policy, works in the opposite direction. So you decrease the money supply, that raises the interest rate, that decreases investment, and that decreases GDP, which, is going to decrease employment or increase unemployment. And so, it works perfectly fine within the AD, aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply framework. All right, so let's look at how monetary policy actually works. All right, so monetary policy is going to be conducted by a country's central bank. So virtually every country has a central bank, and they conduct its country's monetary policy. You can think of a central bank as a banker's bank. So every U.S. bank has an account with the country's central bank, and this central bank's financial obligations underlie the monetary system, the money supply, in the country in which the central bank operates in. So if you remember, before I said that in the U.S. we use Federal Reserve notes, and those Federal Reserve notes are the IOUs that the Fed, the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of the United States, owes the Treasury. Well, those are financial obligations. And so in the U.S., this is fairly straightforward. Other countries operate in the same way. There are they issue the financial obligations, or the IOUs, and those IOUs underlie the country's money supply. All right, so it's also helpful to think about the Fed as not one bank, but of like a regional bank that has 12 regions, and the direction of the Fed is controlled by seven board of governors, plus the New York Fed president, along with a rotating group of 4 presidents of the other 12 regional banks. And this makes up the decision-making body that determines the monetary policy. Now, you're probably asking yourself, all right, why do we have this rotating coalition of decision makers? And fundamentally, it's because different areas of the country sometimes require different monetary policies. And so by rotating membership, effectively each region of the country gets to take a turn directing the monetary policy of the United States. Now, this is important because the U.S. is a very big country, so sometimes monetary policies that would be helpful for, say, California wouldn't be nearly as helpful in other parts of the country. And you see this pretty often. There's this similar problem happening in Europe all the time with the euro. All right, great examples of this happened during the financial crisis as well, particularly, but in this case, the Greek financial crisis. So during this time period, Greece really wanted cheap money, cheap euros, expansionary monetary policy, but this would work against other areas in the Eurozone that actually had really healthy economies and didn't want to risk inflation. So basically, Greece, which needed cheap money, which needed liquidity, needed extra cash in the system, was stuck was stuck was basically stuck within a rock and a hard place because the central bank of the EU, which is essentially controlled by the German model, was very anti-inflationary and didn't want to overly stimulate the eurozone. So Greece was probably stuck in a recession a little bit longer than they needed to be. So I don't know. It's a complicated problem. Obviously, the U.S. is a big country too, so it's easy to imagine that the monetary policy in, say, California, or the optimal monetary policy in California, would be very different from the optimal monetary policy that would be needed in, say, a place like Mississippi or some other rural area. Now, California is probably a bad example right now. They are, because of the homeless population and just the crumbling infrastructure there, they're beginning to be known as the third world country in the U.S. I haven't been out there, but that's what folks say right now. So let's take a look at these regions of the Fed. All right, so here are the 12 regional banks in the United States. So we have the Western area. We have the Dallas Fed, Kansas City Fed, just right down the road, controls this region. The Minneapolis Fed controls this region. We have Chicago, St. Louis, Atlanta, Richmond, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. New York's a bit of an odd duck. They are always in a leadership role. And fundamentally, that's just because they have they just have a large financial sector, right? And they have a large population, so it just makes sense for them to always have some sort of say. Interestingly enough, what is the only state that has 2 Federal Reserve branches? If you said Missouri, that would be you, and that would be correct. We have 2. We have the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank, as well as the St. Louis. Although I'm a little bit insulted because they have the Kansas City Fed over here in Kansas. To take a quick look at that, but last I checked, that building was kind of near well, it's not Brookside. I always forget the name of that fancy area with the Cheesecake Factory. It's a little bit north of there on Main. It's by the World War I monument. I'll have to think about it. Anyway, let's actually take a look at the duties of the Fed. All right, so the Fed has 6 primary duties. These are conducting monetary policy, supervising and regulating financial institutions, serving as a lender of last resort to financial institutions. So this is actually an important one, and it gets into one of the Fed tools that we'll talk about later, so pay attention to that one. It provides the banking services to the U.S. government, and it issues coin and currency. And it also provides financial services to commercial banks, savings and loan associations, banks, and credit unions. All right, so how do we make monetary policy? We've already gone over this, but can't just do a helicopter drop. We went over this. These reserves are the IOUs of the Fed. We've already gone over that. So let's actually engage in a little bit of monetary policy. The first one, and the most commonly used tool by the Fed, is open market operations. And this is the primary way that the Federal Reserve changes the interest rate, which, changes the value of money, which, changes investment, which changes GDP, which changes unemployment, which can get us out of a recession or out of an inflationary gap. All right, so the way this works is the Fed's going to buy or sell treasury bills. And the way they do this is they're going to buy T-bills. They end up buying T-bills. It's going to pay the Treasury with an IOU, those Federal Reserve notes. And then it goes to the bond market and buys bonds. And by purchasing those bonds, that means that cash, those IOUs, are going into banks, and banks can make loans out of it. And what's taken out is financial assets. And those financial assets are taken out. Those can't really be used to make money. So the money supply increases. Alternatively, the Fed can sell bonds. And if the Fed sells bonds, well, then those bonds are going out into the system, and instead of cash sitting in the system, cash is now taken out. And so that ends up having the opposite effect. This ends up increasing the interest rate because the money supply has fallen. And so that decreases the money supply. So for open market operations to work, when open market operations work correctly, to expand the money supply, the Fed is going to buy bonds. So let's just put a little bit of a editorial spin here. If we buy bonds, injecting cash into US. We contract the money supply, well, it's going to sell bonds, and that is taking cash out. All right, this is the first tool of the Fed, open market operations, or the buying and selling of bonds. The second way is changes in the reserve requirement. Now, recall that reserve requirement is the amount of money banks are forced to keep on hand. So, if the reserve requirement falls, what it means is that banks can increase the amount of loans that they can make on, a deposit of X dollars. All right, that is going to increase the money supply. So reductions in the reserve requirement expand the money supply, while increasing does the opposite. Finally, we have the discount rate. And the discount rate is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges banks if banks want to borrow money from the Fed. Now, this is different from the federal funds rate, and this is where the naming convention actually gets confusing. In fact, I thought I made an error when looking at the slides because it's been a little while since I looked at this material. But the discount rate is the tool of the Fed, and it's the interest rate the Fed charges banks to borrow money. The federal funds rate is the interest rate banks charge each other to borrow funds. So, if Bank A finds itself a little bit short of the reserve requirement, the amount of cash that it has to have on hand, it might just choose to go to the a loanable funds market and borrow some money from Bank B, who finds itself with a little excess reserves at the end of the day. And so what that allows Bank A to do, they get charged the federal funds rate from Bank B. Bank B makes a little bit of money, gets rid of their excess reserves, and Bank A satisfies a reserve requirement so they don't get in trouble with the Fed. Now, up until about 2003, the discount rate was below the federal funds rate. And, basically, policymakers felt that no bank would want to feel the shame of borrowing from the government. And they wanted to have this emergency interest rate, this is emergency funds market available for banks who really needed it. Well, banks are corporations, they are super rational. So, what gradually happened is that more and more banks started using the discount rate instead of the federal funds rate because, banks have shareholders and it's in best for shareholders' interest to keep costs as low as possible. And one of the ways they could do that was by, paying the discount rate rather than the higher federal funds rate. So what happened after about 2003 is that the policy changed so that the discount rate was charged with being just slightly higher than the federal funds rate. All right, so how does changes in the discount rate actually relate to expansionary and contractionary monetary policy? Well, basically, it works like any other interest rate. So if you decrease the discount rate, it's going to encourage banks to borrow. If banks can borrow, that means they can make a lot of loans out, and that's going to lead to increases in the money supply. If you increase the discount rate, well, it does the opposite. It increases the cost for borrowing, and so banks aren't going to borrow as much money, and if they can't borrow money, well, then they can't make loans out, and that is going to lead into a decrease in the money supply. All right, so this is actually a fairly good stopping point for today. In the next class, what I would like to do is run through some scenarios and talk about what would be some reasonable responses to these scenarios that the government could use to get us out of a recession or an inflationary gap. And what we're going to see is that we can use fiscal policy and monetary policy at the same time to move us out of the gap that we're in. So you can think of the next class as sort of a review / application of, let me get the chapters in the textbook. Reviews of chapter 26. And 29 and 30. And this is in the 9th edition of the textbook. So I'll be here for the next few minutes. Type some questions if you have them. If you don't have any questions, that means we're just gonna call it for today. Anyway, I'll be here for the next 5 or so minutes. Type questions if you got them. Thanks, Dawson. You too. All right. Looks like people are exiting, so we are good to go. Bye.